Important. Alrighty, let us begin for today. All right, happy Friday, everybody. It's the second Friday of the semester. We're almost at ad drop. I think the ad drop deadline is either next Monday or Tuesday. So if you want out, you only have that long before you're stuck and have to pay partial fees. Okay. All right. Yes, I can do all these things. Okay, very quickly. Yes, everything is non-cumulative. So yeah, midterm 2 and final don't have anything to do with midterm 1 content. Okay, I'll start with that. Is Antonio Gramsci post-structuralist or a conflict theorist? Kind of both, right? Like, he is really a conflict theorist in that he's an old school kind of Marxist, but the post-structuralists take a lot of his ideas and that cultural turn of conflict theory takes a lot of ideas from Gramsci that then get branched off by people like Foucault. So definitely a conflict theorist, and his ideas are the basis for a lot of post-structuralism. The definition of post-structuralism. So basically, there's a movement. It's called post-structuralism specifically because there's a movement earlier in the 20th century, not surprisingly, called structuralism. And basically, structuralism is really interested in looking at language and things like written texts according to their linguistic structure. And there's a whole, you have to go take literary theory in order to get the explanations of that. But post-structuralism says that actually what we need to worry about when it comes to language and such things is something entirely different. It's the way that language has to do with power, right? It's how language ultimately, or how people and agencies and institutions and structures use language basically to gain power in society, right? So that is, it's not really a definition of post-structuralism, but they look beyond kind of the structure of language into the ideological basis behind it. Okay. Not at all a dumb question. So communism is, basically is a political system where you organize things essentially by common ownership of the means of production, whereas Marxism is an ideological system that basically you think about the world in terms of kind of these class conflicts. Now, there's going to be different forms of Marxism. There's going to be kind of unreconstructed Marxism, which is the straight, everything is, economic class conflict. And then there's more reconstructed forms of Marxism, which, will branch out into different forms of power, right? And oppression. So you might have racial, gender-based, right? The patriarchy and such, forms of kind of conflict theory or Marxism. But communism denotes a very specific political organizational system. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So we ended off on this slide, right? This is the post-structuralism, and we all are, in some senses, post-structuralists today. This school of thought that originated in mid-20th century France with guys like Foucault, with Jacques Derrida, with Baudrillard, I forget his first name, Jean-Jacques Lyotard. Anyway, all the names are not super important. There's a whole bunch of them. But basically, the idea was, there's no stable social relations. They think of everything always being in flux, right? People always doing this push and pull of trying to gain power over each other principally through language, right? And principally through defining, certain categories as standard or normal and defining everything else out of existence. So the struggle of post-structuralism is to break down those binaries and then introduce, a whole kind of range of meanings between them, right? So I talked a little bit about last time how one particular branch of post-structuralism that we'll talk about maybe today, maybe on Monday, we'll see how we do. It's called queer theory, and one of the kind of principles in queer theory is to break down the sort of A couple of binaries, right? Male, female, or man, woman as a kind of binary, and introduce a whole bunch of different kind of possible identifications in a spectrum between those things, or beyond them even. And then, something like gay and straight as the only two kind of possibilities in terms of sexuality, and to say, well, between that, there's a whole bunch of other kind of possible sexual identities that you could have in there. And I think, given, what, the world we live in now, you can see where this kind of post-structuralist thinking, well, you probably have never read, Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault or any of the other people who kind of follow in that tradition. You're all deeply affected, and the world we live in today is deeply affected by this particular school of thought. Okay, I have a short-ish video on Foucault, just to kind of give you more background on who he was and his kind of thoughts. So we'll do that now. Here we go.
Michel Foucault was a French 20th century philosopher and historian who spent his career forensically criticizing the power of the modern bourgeois capitalist state, including its police, law courts, prisons, doctors, and psychiatrists. His goal was to work out nothing less than how power worked, and then to change it in the direction of a Marxist anarchist utopia. Though he spent most of his life in libraries and seminar rooms, he was a committedly revolutionary figure. He met with enormous popularity in elite Parisian intellectual circles. Jean-Paul Sartre admired him deeply, and he still maintains a wide following among young people studying at university in the prosperous corners of the world. His background, which he was extremely reluctant ever to talk about and tried to prevent journalists from investigating at all costs, was very privileged. Both his parents were inordinately rich, coming from a long line of successful surgeons in Poitiers in west-central France. His father, Dr. Paul Foucault, came to represent all that Michel would hate about bourgeois France. Michel had a standard upper-class education. He went to elite Jesuit institutions, was an altar boy, and his parents hoped he would become a doctor. But Michel wasn't quite like other boys. He started self-harming and thinking constantly of suicide. At university, he decorated his bedroom with images of torture by Goya. When he was 22, he tried to commit suicide and was forced by his father, against his will, to see France's most famous psychiatrist, Jean Dolay, at the Hôpital Sainte-Anne in Paris. The doctor wisely diagnosed that a lot of Michel's distress came from having to keep his homosexuality, and in particular, his interest in extreme sadomasochism, away from a censorious society. Gradually, Foucault entered the underground gay scene in France, fell in love with a drug dealer, and then took up with a transvestite. For long periods in his 20s, he went to live abroad in Sweden, Poland, and Germany, where he felt his sexuality would be less constrained. All the while, Foucault was progressing up the French academic ladder. The seismic event of his intellectual life came in the summer of 1953, when Foucault was 27 and on holiday with a lover in Italy. There he came across Nietzsche's book, Untimely Meditations, which contains an essay called On the Uses and Abuses of History for Life. In the essay, Nietzsche argued that academics had poisoned our sense of how history should be read and taught. They made it seem as if one should read history in some sort of a disinterested way in order to learn how it all was in the past. But Nietzsche rejected this with sarcastic fury. There was no point learning about the past for its own sake. The only reason to read and study history is to dig out from the past ideas, concepts, and examples which can help us to lead a better life in our own times. This essay liberated Foucault intellectually, as nothing had till then. Immediately, he changed the direction of his work and decided to become a particular kind of philosophical historian, someone who could look back into the past to help to sort out the urgent issues of his own time. 8 years later, he was ready to publish what's recognized as his first masterpiece, Madness and Civilization. The standard view is that we now treat people with mental illness in so much more of a humane way than we ever did in the past. After all, we put them in hospitals, give them drugs, and get them looked after by people with PhDs. But this was exactly the attitude that Foucault wished to demolish in Madness and Civilization. In the book, he argued that things way back in the Renaissance were actually far better for the mad than they subsequently became. In the Renaissance, the mad were felt to be different rather than crazy. They were thought to possess a kind of wisdom because they demonstrated the limits of reason. They were revered in many circles and were allowed to wander freely. But But then, as Foucault's historical researches showed him, in the mid-17th century, a new attitude was born that relentlessly medicalized and institutionalized mentally ill people. No longer were they allowed to live alongside the so-called sane. They were taken away from their families and locked up in asylums and seen as people one should try to cure rather than tolerate for just being different. You can recognize a very similar underlying philosophy in Foucault's next great book, The Birth of the Clinic. His target here was medicine more broadly. He systematically attacked the view that medicine had become more humane with time. He conceded that, of course, we have better drugs and treatments now, but he believed that in the 18th century, the professional doctor was born, and that he was a sinister figure who would look at the patient always with what Foucault called the medical gaze, denoting a dehumanizing attitude that looked at a patient just as a set of organs, not a person. One was, under the medical gaze, merely a malfunctioning kidney or liver, not a person to be considered as a whole entity. Next in Foucault's oeuvre came Discipline and Punish. Here, Foucault did his standard thing on state punishment. Again, the normal view is that the prison and punishing systems of the modern world are so much more humane than they were in the days when people just used to be hung in public squares. Not so, argued Foucault. The problem, he said, is that power now looks kind, but isn't, whereas in the past it clearly wasn't kind, and therefore could encourage open rebellion and protest. Foucault noted that in the past, at an execution, a convict's body could become a focus of sympathy and admiration, and the executioner, rather than the convict, could become the locus of shame. Also, public executions often led to riots in support of the prisoner. But with the invention of the modern prison system, everything happened in private behind locked gates. One could no longer see and therefore resist state power. That's what made the modern system of punishment so barbaric and properly primitive in Foucault's eyes. Foucault's last work was the multi-volume History of Sexuality. The maneuvers he performed in relation to sex are again very familiar. Foucault rebelled against the view that we're all now deeply liberated and at ease with sex. He argued that since the 18th century, we have relentlessly medicalized sex, handing it over to professional sex researchers and scientists. We live in an age of what Foucault called scientia sexualis, science of sexuality. But Foucault looked back with considerable nostalgia to the cultures of Rome, China, and Japan, where he detected the rule of what he called an ars erotica, erotic art, where the whole focus was on how to increase the pleasure of sex rather than merely understand and label it. Once again, modernity was blamed for pretending there'd been progress, when there was in fact just a loss of spontaneity and imagination. Foucault wrote the last volume of this work while dying of AIDS that he had contracted in a San Francisco gay bar. He died in 1984, age 58. Foucault's lasting contribution is to the way we look at history. There are lots of things in the modern world that we're constantly being told are fantastic, and were apparently very bad in the past, for example, education, or the media, or our communication systems. Foucault encourages us to break away from our optimistic smugness about now, and to go back and see in history many ways of doing things which were perhaps superior. Foucault wasn't trying to get us to be nostalgic. He wanted us to pick up some lessons of way back in order to improve how we live now. Academic historians have tended to hate Foucault's work. They think it inaccurate and keep pointing out things he hadn't quite understood in some document or other. But Foucault didn't care for total historical accuracy. History for him was just a storehouse of good ideas, and he wanted to raid it rather than keep it pristine and untouched. We should use Foucault as an inspiration to look at the dominant ideas and institutions of our times, and to question them by looking at their histories and evolutions. Foucault did something remarkable. He made history life-enhancing and philosophically rich again. He can be an inspiring figure for our own projects.
Okay, so that's Foucault in a nutshell, right? So yeah, I mean, again, all about the way that the project of modernity, right? So this period, really starting kind of with the scientific and industrial revolutions, led to particular ways of thinking about the world, right? And for Foucault, really like increases in power for certain groups, right? Doctors and scientists in particular. And he wants to break all of this down. So we get from him sort of postmodernism, right? And from other people who are doing the same kind of work. There's a whole movement of this in France around the same time, which is basically trying to move past the modern. And there's a particular part of the modern, they kind of mention it in this video, which is called the narrative of progress, right? The narrative of progress is this idea that, from the Enlightenment forward, as we apply reason, human reason and the scientific method to society, the world will get better and better, right? We'll get better medicines, better drugs, we'll live happier lives in general. And what Foucault sort of says, and other people in this school as well, is that that's just a story, right? That's the story of modernity, and that we should reject it, right? Because it's just one of these stories that gives power to particular people, right? In this case, in a lot of ways, to the nation state, to the scientific establishment, to doctors, right? And that we should reject that and look at the history of this idea, because actually there is no grand story, right? There is no direction to history, right? History isn't moving, from worse to better, right? We don't end up in utopia. It's just there's no direction to it at all. And anyone who claims that there is a direction is just making a play for power at the end of the day. All right. All good? Okay. Just want to, do I have the right? Okay, I do have the right kind of slides. Sometimes I have the wrong one and it doesn't show questions. So I do have the right one. Fun time with Foucault is over. Okay. I say fun time with Foucault because I once spent probably about 3 months as part of my PhD where my supervisor's like, I think you need to read Foucault. And I'm like, oh, which one? She's like, no, just read all of it. So I spent, several months just reading Foucault every day for like 6 hours a day, which was super fun, by the way. All right, so the last kind of big school that we're going to kind of come back to, and then we're going to talk about some minor schools in sociology. So this is the last of the big kind of 3 traditions we're going to talk about, and we're going to keep coming back to all of these in the course. So it's functionalism, conflict theory, with all of the stuff that's in conflict theory that we just went through. And then this is the last one, symbolic interactionism, right? Okay, so symbolic interactionism is a slightly different school of sociology. And really it is focused on a couple of things, right? So it focuses on interpersonal communication in the micro-social level, right? It wants to know the meaning people make out of words and symbols, right? And how that kind of structures their lives. It emphasizes that social life is possible only because people attach meaning to things, right? Because we have language, because we have symbols, and these are mostly things that are shared. That's how we create a social life. It stresses this kind of thing that people help create their social circumstances. They don't merely react to them, right? So Peter Berger, who's one person I would put in this symbolic interactionist school, talks about this in kind of, I think, an interesting way, suggesting that, we are both as individuals, right? As an individual, you are constituted by the culture that you are born into and raised in, right? So you are yourself sort of an outgrowth of that culture. Okay, so you're affected by the culture. I don't think that's surprising to anybody, but at the same time, you also, and you as an individual, or even then the you as a collective, reconstitute culture yourselves, right? So that culture is never this kind of, for interactionists, culture is never this sort of static thing, right? It is this thing that is constantly sort of, I hesitate to use the word evolving, but that's probably the best word. It kind of moves in a I guess like a dialectic, right? Where, the people of a generation are shaped by the culture they're born into, but they themselves then sort of reconstitute that culture based on their own experiences of the world, right? And so you get this kind of 2-step, you're shaped by culture, then you shape the culture, and then a new kind of form of that culture emerges, which is then passed on to the next generation. And it's just this ongoing kind of cycle, right? Where, say like the reinterpretation that happens in the 1960s of the role of men and women, right? Of what we sometimes think of as the feminist movement or the women's liberation movement. People were shaped in a culture prior to that, but then their observation of the world and what was going on caused them to then reshape that culture. And so say the culture of Canada or the US was then reshaped, and a different kind of form of that same culture came out of that process, right? So it's this kind of ongoing process, this dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, right? shaped by the culture, you shape the culture. So the thesis, you're shaped by the culture. The antithesis, you reshape that culture. And then the synthesis, a new culture is sort of born and you pass it on, though it's in a continuity with the culture that came before it. Okay, so, yeah, and I mean, interactionism, I guess, at its best, sort of, yeah, will increase our understanding and tolerance of people who might be different from us, generally over time, right? You might see how they are shaped by their cultural location, right? By the culture they're born into, and then possibly how they are themselves reshaping it. And they may be reshaped by their interaction with you and your culture, right? So you can have this kind of push and pull between how people are interacting with the culture in general. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So interactionism. I mean, one of the big figures here is Max Weber. Again, I know I put him in conflict theory, but he's also here in symbolic interactionism. And yeah, symbolic interactionism is focused on understanding people's motives and the meaning they attach to things, right? So what is the meaning that people attach to things and how does that shape their behavior? How does that shape how they navigate the world? I think one of the really interesting ones, I'll talk about the Protestant ethic here and why Weber is kind of put into this camp, right? One of the things that Weber talked about in a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which I think I mentioned last class, was this idea that, beyond just, economic forces or historical forces, there are other forces that can shape the way a culture is organized. And specifically in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, Max Weber sort of thinks about how a particular group of Christians, they're Protestants in Northern Europe that are following the beliefs of John Calvin, who was one of the Protestant reformers, so they're called Calvinists, how their particular way of understanding Christianity changed the way that they acted, right? And that how that change in the way they acted ultimately drove the growth of capitalism in the Netherlands, principally, and then England, right? So basically, one of the things that Weber says is that Calvinism in particular stressed a couple of things, right? One, it got rid of the sacraments, so the way that Catholics would have understood how they were saved, how they got to go to heaven, right? That you would get it through things that are done by the church, right? Things like confession and communion and all this kind of stuff. Calvinism got rid of all of that, and so suddenly people had no way of knowing if they got into heaven. Calvin also had this idea that only people selected by God, before birth, what he called the elect, would get into heaven, right? So then, people were then very worried, well, am I on the guest list? Do I get to go to heaven? There was nothing really you could do. So they were always trying to prove by right living that they had somehow been blessed by God. So they did things like working really hard, saving money, reinvesting in their businesses. And for Weber, this sort of drove the beginnings of the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. All right, I have a very quick, we'll let Stephen Fry explain it to you again, this time with pictures. I'll come back.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Okay, so I mean that's basically right, this idea that the way people interpret, say, something about their religious lives, a religious teaching, some kind of meaning that's been handed down by society, can change the way they behave, which then drives a social change, right? Now, as it turns out, I'll say when we get to talk about religion at the end, kind of towards the end of the course, I'll say it again. This thesis by Weber is wrong, right? He's actually wrong about the growth of capitalism. He's wrong about its links to Protestantism. And I can tell you all about that later on. But it sort of births a school of thinking, right? Where, and I'll say historians knew he was wrong, like the moment he published the book. He got intense criticism, kind of like Foucault, about like, well, actually, you've got a bunch of the historical facts kind of sideways, upside down, and backwards. But okay. And one really prominent sociologist who I'm a big fan of, named Rodney Stark, who's probably the most important sociologist of religion probably ever, noted of Weber's book that he called it a book so stupid that only sociologists could possibly believe it was true. So I don't know what that says, that we keep teaching it all the time. And like whenever I've taught classical social theory, I never teach it because of specifically that critique. But it kind of changed the way people thought about things a little bit, right? That, people, their cultural kind of interpretation of something like salvation, right, can change the way they act, which can drive enormous social change. And that's sort of the idea of symbolic interactionism. Okay. Other kind of figures that come a little bit later than Weber, I guess like Mead is a contemporary of Weber's, dies a few years after Weber does. And Mead, basically his kind of thinking was that in this interactionist kind of framework, that an individual's sense of self is formed in how they interact with other people, right? That basically, right, you learn who you are as a social subject, as a person in the world, not, by some abstract, there's not like a core of who you are, according to Mead, deep inside, that you kind of have to like dig down into yourself to find, who you really are. Like you are, again, this is sociological thinking. There's not like an essence of who you are as a person that you need to discover through some, process, right? You're not in this thinking, like you weren't made by God to be a certain kind of person. You have to discover what your purpose in life is, or by fate or the universe or anything like that, right? You're a social being who is shaped by social processes, right? And so you're formed in interaction with other people. You're shaped by the culture you're born into. You're shaped by the family you're born into. And we learn, according to Mead, who you are, right? We learn who we are by taking the role of other people we interact with and seeing ourselves as they are, right? So it's this almost idea of like the mirror self, right? Where it's like you're interacting with a professor at university, right? And let's say a professor in university, and you are sort of like reacting to their reaction to you in a sense, right? You're like, how is this person seeing me? How do they understand me? And what does that say about me, right? Like, so you're interacting, or how your parents treat you, right? This is the idea, like if your parents treat you kind of as a child as if you're stupid or a bad child, right? You might start to reflect that, because in your interaction with, say, an adult authority figure, you're going to be like, well, that's clearly who I am because this is how they are treating me, right? So it's in viewing yourself through their eyes, in a sense, that your self-concept is formed, right? And this is why, this thinking is very influential. This is why, like in the 1970s and 80s, you get such a hard push on kind of affirmative or child affirmation towards this idea of building up their self-esteem, right? This is a classic thing that happens with the millennial generation, is that their parents, shaped by this kind of thinking, really focus on treating them positively so that they have good self-esteem, because it's like, okay, we want in our behavior towards them as adults for them to see themselves as competent, capable, and all of these things. Now, I mean, as it turns out, especially for the millennials, there's lots of arguments. I think here of Jean Twenge's argument in her book, Generation Me, that what this did was turn millennials into a bunch of narcissists. But sometimes unintended consequences of ideas, right? But this is the kind of thinking that's going on when we talk about Mead. Irving Goffman, he's now a 20th century kind of active, mostly in the middle part of the 20th century, sociologist in the United States, and Goffman, very influential in lots of ways. But basically, one of the kind of contributions in symbolic interactionism that Goffman makes is this idea that people present themselves to others in everyday light to basically appear in the best light possible, right? And he says it's kind of like a stage play, right? Like people are taking on roles in life, right? And they move in different parts, right? They move from, the front of the class, like the front stage to the backstage, right? Sometimes they're just a supporting character. Other times they're the star of the show. And you move kind of through a wide range of kind of actions and props and roles that you take in life, as the social situation needs. And then you judge how people are reacting to it and adjust as needed to always appear in the best light. And I mean, one kind of example of this that I always think about when I think of Goffman is a few years ago, I was teaching a class, and it was a class for engineers, Sociology 366, people in industry, possibly the most boring class I've ever been assigned to teach, because the engineering department wanted it very limited on a very small number of things. And it's like, teach about people in industry. And it's like, that sounds super fun. But I needed the money, so, you do what you got to do. Anyway, I had a friend of mine who's an engineer come in, and I was like, oh yeah, it's because, and if you ever come and if somehow, and it probably will never happen, but if we were to become friends and, you came over to my house for dinner, trust me, it'll never happened. Never happened yet. You would see a very different kind of Jeff Broussard. When I'm up here, I'm kind of taking on a role, right? It's kind of like, and this is always the advice I give to grad students who are teaching for the first time, I'm like, figure out what your in-class persona is, and put on that mask every time you do it. And for me now, it's like automatic, right? I just take out the headphones, turn on the live stream, and bang, I'm in the role. But it is very much like a role. I'm kind of stepping into a role of professor, of lecturer. Do I always talk this much with my hands, or is that like a thing I do in class only? Time for deep analysis, I think. Drives my Fitbit crazy because it thinks at one point it thought I was swimming. I don't know. Anyway, right? Stepping into a role, right? This is what we all kind of do. And this was Goffman saying, right? Is like you go home, right, to your parents and you step into a role, right? Oh, I'll tell you this. This is a funny thing that kind of made me think of this too this summer. So we were hanging out with my wife's brother and his wife, so my in-laws. And, she was complaining about when they go visit my wife's parents, because they have a lake house in Kelowna, that her husband, my brother-in-law, my wife's brother, basically reverts into a kind of role of almost the child when he's there, right? So when he's hanging around his parents, suddenly he's it's like he's back to being a child, like when he was growing up. He falls into the same roles, tries to appease his mother, who's impossible, my mother-in-law. You can laugh. In the same way, right? Trust me, she doesn't watch the live stream. It's all good. In the same way, and it drives my sister-in-law crazy. She's like, now it's like I'm taking care of 3 children, because they have 2 kids. because he's suddenly like fallen into this child role and he's completely useless. And I guess, you have to be like, if you don't finish your dinner, you won't get any ice cream. I don't think it's quite that bad. But right, this is like you fall into roles, right? And like my wife, the second she's around her mother, is my mother-in-law really is quite taciturn, to put it kindly. And the second my wife's around her, she's constantly trying to appease her to keep her wrath from exploding, and kind of ruining the day or whatever it happens to be. So everybody kind of falls into these roles, right? You have roles and you kind of sink back into them, and you're often not even aware that you're sort of like jumping in and out of these roles, right? Kind of constantly, and this is the kind of thing that Goffman says we do all the time, right? We're always trying to be in the best light. We're trying to please people. We're trying to have positive social interactions, especially with people we care about. And so we take on these different roles as we move through life, and in different contexts, we kind of move through these things in all sorts of different ways. Okay. So, social constructionism. The cultural turn and post-structuralism is a take on conflict theory. Social constructionism is a take on symbolic interactionism, right? And basically, taking this kind of idea, it essentially says that, society, rather than anything natural, is composed of a bunch of social constructs, right? So yeah, when people interact, they assume things are natural or innately as they seem, but much of that is, sustained by social processes that vary historically and culturally and that aren't given, right? So, again, you can probably already think of a few examples, right? But gender roles, right? Sometimes thought of, and historically, gender roles were very much thought of as genetically determined, right? Biologically determined, right? And if you go back until very recently, people tended to think of, men as a particular way, strong, stoic, blah, 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 whatever it was, and women as caring, nurturing, motherly, all of these sorts of things. What this kind of thinking said is that, okay, our ideas of man and woman, masculinity, femininity, are socially constructed, right? They are in place and we tend to assume them in a lot of ways, but they're held up by a whole bunch of social systems that are anchored in history, right? Now, this might be kind of culture, right? It might be religion, right? It might be a whole bunch of things, right? The patriarchy, if you're thinking about, the way that the definition of women and femininity has sort of kept women in a particular sphere of life, typically the domestic sphere. Historically, that's, socially constructed, and feminists will come out and say that this is part of the patriarchy, right? There's a whole system of ways that men have sort of dominated women by propagating certain ideas, right? By, religion defining women in certain ways, that all of these things are socially constructed, right? That's one example, but essentially, even things like the way people dress, right? What is considered appropriate dress would be socially constructed. So, if we went back, I'm just trying to think. If we went back to, say, the 1950s even, not even really that long ago, right? How did people dress to go to a hockey game, say at Maple Leaf Gardens or at the Montreal Forum? Well, the men who went there would have been in probably a suit and tie and probably would have had a fedora, right? That was a socially constructed way of how you dress appropriately for a sporting event. Now, if you went to Rogers Place to watch a hockey game, people are dressed in jerseys and if any of my experiences are correct, they've already had way too much to drink before they even get there, and then they have to get up to pee 82 times, and they block half the game. But that's the last time I went to a hockey game, I almost decked the guy in front of me, just either leave or sit down, but stop getting up in the middle of the play. I hate you. There was a thing. We got into an argument. I'm not the most physically imposing person, and I should not get into a fight with anybody. But I think I could have taken this guy because I think a stiff breeze would have knocked him over by that point. Anyway, but right, like what's appropriate behavior? That's all socially constructed. If it had been in the 1950s and he'd been drunk off his ass at the Montreal Forum, he probably would have been kicked out by security because that would not have been seen as appropriate. All of these things, manners, appropriate dress, gender roles. These are all things that social constructionists say are supported by a whole bunch of social institutions that tell people what is the appropriate thing to do, how do you act in certain spaces, all this kind of stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. That's it in a nutshell. I should just check if I went if, okay. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So, yes, I can answer these questions. I'm glad I went back before I got to queer theory, because that is a whole different thing. Should you try to memorize every single historical figure and discuss, we discussed for the midterm, just general concepts? I would say just understand the concepts that are within, say, symbolic interactionism. Because what's probably inside, I'll just kind of tell you, and you'll see them when I put up example questions, and I'm working on it. I just haven't had time. A pretty typical question on the midterm, and I won't spend too much time explaining these things in the future until we get to Q&A before the exam, but I know people are asking because they want to know how to study. A pretty typical way I'll ask a question is I'll give you a story, right? Like it's called a vignette question, where it's like Jack, is interested in gender roles, and he thinks that gender roles are supported by social institutions. Into which school would he fit, right? Is he a conflict theorist, a symbolic interactionist, or blah, 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 right? Or which figure would he be most likely to identify with? So if you have, and it'll be pretty disparate, right? I wouldn't give you a choice between like Mead and Goffman, because that's way too close. But it'd be like Marx, Durkheim, Goffman, so that kind of thing, right? It's a little story telling you what this person thinks, or, whatever. What process does this represent? Like, which idea does this most closely align with? Those are the kinds of questions, right? So you should know, at least kind of know the differences between them. You don't have to memorize them. I'm not going to give you like a list of 4 people that you have to choose between, because I don't like to do that. But yeah, I that just to kind of understand vaguely what they said and how it's maybe different from each other. But you don't have to like memorize it in great detail. They're not written questions. They're all multiple choice. Okay. For the midterm, do you need to know the historical figures correspond? No, I will not test you on birth and death dates. I think that's dumb. Anyway, I don't see any reason to do that. Okay, let's go back to Protestant ethic. How are we doing for time? Bad. Okay. Can I explain how Protestant ethic is related to symbolic interactionism? Right. So, I mean, it would be in the interpretation of religious ideas, right? So a concept, right? So a concept like salvation, right? How do you get salvation, and how do you know that you're saved? Calvinists had a particular way, like you were selected by God. How would you know you were selected by God? Well, you were doing really well. Well, you want to make sure that you keep doing really well, because otherwise you might not know that you're saved. So you invest, you save, you invest, right? And for Weber, that is what drove capitalism, right? But it was basically this idea like, we understand this term, salvation, and how you get it to be this, right? And therefore they adjusted their social behaviors correspondingly. And for Weber, that's what led to the rise of capitalism in Northern Europe. Okay, do I think people fall into roles? They do, because it's what feels familiar, and familiarity feels better than cognitive dissonance. I mean, I personally, probably, I think they also are, you're reacting to how people react to you, right? And I think that's the Mead and kind of Goffman idea, is that you're trying to get the most positive interaction you possibly can from people. People, so you want to try to step into roles that are going to get you that most positive interaction. Now, I think some of those can be very dysfunctional, right? Like my brother-in-law almost falling into a childlike state, I wouldn't suggest as a life goal. But, it's sometimes, again, people aren't doing it necessarily consciously, and I don't think the interactionists think it's conscious, just that people are kind of doing this reflexive process as part of human nature. How does Goffman's theory explain negative behavior? Well, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that things can fall into dysfunction, right? And failure to be properly socialized, to learn proper social roles or to have positive feedback on those things, I think for Goffman would mean that this cycle gets kind of interrupted. Now, I think then sometimes people are looking for other sources of affirmation, so they might engage in antisocial behavior on a social level, right? But that's getting them kind of a positive kind of interaction with certain people, right? This is one of the kind of theories of gang membership. Why do people get involved in crime or gangs? Well, they start associating with other people who are antisocial, and then they get a positive feedback loop from that. It's like, okay, let's all break into the 7-Eleven and steal Funyuns. Oh, wasn't that awesome? We're all so happy. We're high-fiving each other. That was awesome how you, held up the cashier or whatever, or distracted him. And then you get a kind, you got a positive kind of interaction with that group of people, and you kind of build on that. So I think that's sort of the Goffman-y way of thinking about it. I got 4 minutes. Oh, queer theory. Can I do queer theory in 4 minutes? I will try. Very quickly. Should I not try? Okay, let's not try. You were pretty clear. You're very clear on that. All right, we'll pick up here on Monday. We're almost done with concepts and theories, so we'll finish up hopefully on Monday, and we'll go from there. See you on Monday. Have a great weekend.